Good evening, everybody. My name is Andy Smith, and I am head of long range and transportation planning for the city of Walnut Creek. And I want to welcome you all and thank you for joining us today. This is, or I should say this evening, this will be the first of two community workshops that we'll be holding on two important parts of our city's general plan. And the general plan, of course, is the city's long range master plan, something that's has a kind of a 25-year vision on the long end and current to 5 years on the short end. These two subject areas cover both housing and public safety. So as I said, of course, two very important subject areas. And we have we're doing some updating to the general plan in these areas. And we have a strong team of consultants headed by Hita Mosesman, who you can see on camera here. And I'm actually going to go ahead and turn it over to Hita now. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Good evening, everyone. Very happy to be here to discuss the general plan update. As Andy said, my name is Hita Mosesman. I'm Vice President of Community Development and Housing with Harrison Associates. We're the city's housing element and safety element consulting team. And we will get started on this first community workshop for the housing element update. So in terms of the agenda, just to let you know what to expect in terms of the presentation, we're going to do team introductions and talk about meeting guidelines to make sure everybody has a good opportunity to participate. We'll talk about what the housing element is and why we're talking about it and why it's being updated. We'll talk about something called the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or RHNA, which is basically a technical term for the number of units the city has to plan for over the next 8 years. We'll talk about the housing needs in the city right now, a needs assessment of that, which is going to be informed by some polling questions that we have for you this evening to ask you, the community, what you feel that the housing needs are right now, and share some information on some analysis that we've done to date as we start. With the safety element, similarly, we are here to discuss what that is, why we're amending it, and we have similar types of poll questions to find out what safety concerns are in the community right now. And then we'll finish off the presentation by talking about the community engagement process and some additional opportunities to participate. So to start, this is the team working on the housing and safety element updates. Andy just introduced himself with the City of Walnut Creek. Andy's working very closely with Nancy Brigado from Brigado Planning. Nancy's acting as an extension of city staff in terms of managing this process on the city side. There's myself, Hita Mosesman, with Harrison Associates. I am the housing element lead. We have Darren Neufeld, also from Harris, who is the safety element lead. And we have Dima Galkin with our firm, who is the senior project manager for both elements. So we had some guidelines and sort of an approach to participating to ensure that you can share your ideas and provide input. So we had a few sort of etiquette moments here. During the presentation, the audience will be muted to allow us to provide some background and foundational information to you all. And then also allow us to do the polling questions as well. If you do have a question, if you could click on the Q&A, which is at the bottom center of your screen, that will allow you to type in questions that we can then see and then answer at the end of the presentation. If you could also use the Q&A to provide some additional answers, you'll see that a few of the polling questions ask for an other type of response. And that's where we'd like you to type into the Q&A at the time the polling happens there. Also, if you look at the all questions under the Q&A, please feel free to like any questions or any responses to show your support for a particular item. So to start, the housing element really is, as Andy alluded to, the primary planning document to address housing needs in the city. State law requires that every city and county in California have a housing element as part of their general plan. Also requires that a general plan be adopted by all cities and counties. If you think about a general plan as a book, The housing element and the safety element are chapters in that book, along with other elements that guide the planning and community development of the city. The housing element addresses the housing needs of residents at all income levels. And it really is a way to implement the city's vision and plan to meet the housing needs that are occurring now and in the future. It is, the whole process is sort of overseen, and at the end needs to be certified by the State Department of Housing and Community Development. They review the housing element document, and they will need to certify that it's in compliance with state law. A few things the housing element does not do. We wanted to sort of cover that real quickly. First, it does not require the city to build housing. Developers traditionally build housing, and what the city is doing is laying the foundation for that and completing the planning to facilitate the development. The second thing a housing element does not do is require the city to fund housing in the community. The private sector and the development community, they pay for the development of housing as they build it. Affordable housing does require public subsidies, but those subsidies traditionally come from state and federal resources primarily. So there's no, the housing element does not obligate the city to fund housing in the community. The third thing it does not do is authorize the construction of any development project. So housing projects will still need to go through the development review process. The housing element contains several sections, many of them prescribed by state law, and you'll hear me say that a few times during the presentation, because we do need to achieve legal compliance with state laws. And so just to explain the reasoning for why there is a certain element as part of this document, I will point back to the law as to why that is happening. So in terms of the housing element, there are several sections. First section is community profile. It's really a lot of demographic information about the community and the characteristics, as well as identifying special needs populations like seniors, large family households, and persons and families experiencing homelessness. There's also a housing constraints section that identifies any delays or barriers to developing housing. Those could be either governmental, federal, state, or local regulations and laws that provide a constraint, or market constraints, such as the high cost of building materials, labor shortages, and the like. The housing element also, as I alluded to earlier, identifies the housing needs in the community based again on this type of public input and data sources. It also identifies the challenges and opportunities in meeting those needs. There is a review of the last housing element that was done about 8 years ago to look at the housing units that were built as part of that effort. There is a detailed housing plan with goals, objectives, programs, and policies that will be implemented to further housing in the community. It will also contain a list of very specific housing sites by property that will identify a certain number of units that would be planned for that property, as well as the income levels that would be served by those units. And finally, there is a new requirement for the first time in this housing element cycle called a fair housing analysis that we're going to dive into a little bit more in the next slide. So more specifically, the term is affirmatively furthering fair housing. This section of the housing element really focuses on social equity and environmental justice issues. It'll cover things like fair housing violations, if any, enforcement, and outreach capacity. It looks at patterns of segregation and integration and provides history of the planning patterns in the city, and if there were any resulting segregation and integration issues as because of that planning process. It covers disparities in access to opportunities, namely housing opportunities. Looks at disproportionate housing needs and displacement risks for residents. It looks at not only racially concentrated areas of poverty, but also affluence as well. And finally, looks at environmental hazards, again, tying back to environmental justice issues. So why is the housing element being updated at this time? So again, as I mentioned earlier, it is prescribed by state law that it must be updated every 8 years. And this is the time that the city of Walnut Creek needs to update their housing element. It allows for the housing element to be updated to match new housing laws that have been passed. And there have been a number of them in the last 5 or 6 years. It also shows how the city will facilitate the demand for housing and the growth in the community. It allows the city to continue qualifying for state and regional funding. And it really helps open things up to the community to assist in the planning process for housing. There is a process that needs to be followed to update and approve the housing element. And again, it is prescribed by state law. Right now, we're in the first phase, which is community outreach, which really kicked off last month with a planning commission and city council study sessions. There were 2. And now we're on our first workshop in that process. So this community outreach process started this spring and continues really until the housing element is, the final housing element is adopted. So it will continue for nearly a year. The housing element draft will be prepared and incorporating the input that we receive from the workshop, as well as surveys that I am going to bring up later in the presentation. We anticipate the draft to go to Planning Commission, City Council in this summer. And shortly thereafter, that draft will be submitted to the Department of Housing and Community Development for their review. They have a mandatory 90-day review period. At the end of that, they will submit comments or edits, what they call findings, to the city. We work through those with the state, and we then prepare the final to go to Planning Commission, City Council in January of next year, with an estimated certification in May of next year. And again, by having the adopted and compliant housing element, it allows the city to continue to be eligible for state and regional funding. So as I mentioned, the housing element allows the city to plan for housing units in the future. The number of housing units that must be planned for are not really determined by the city alone. That process really starts at the state level with the Department of Housing and Community Development. They determine and assess what the housing needs are in the state by region. And they allocate a total number to each regional entity, in this case, ABAG, or the Association of Bay Area Governments. That number is 441,176 for the entire ABAG Bay Area region. ABAG then does collect some information from the city on what the city feels the needs would be, but develops a methodology to parcel out an allocation to each city and county within their jurisdiction. So Walnut Creek received a total allocation of 5,805 units from ABAG. And this is what we refer to as the RHNA, or the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. So this table depicts the fact that the housing units that are allocated, the 5,805 units, are not in just any category of affordability. The state does require that the total regional allocation be split up into different income categories based on needs and the methodology that ABAG came up with. So you can see here, we have a number of different income categories ranging from extremely low, very low, to above moderate income. And so this table really depicts what those income categories would look like in Walnut Creek and in Contra Costa County. For example, low income in the county is 50 to 80% of what's called area median income, or basically average household income. And the range of incomes for low income, that designation, is about $63,000 to $100,000 of income per year per household. And then if you follow the table with the column to the right, you see that the allocation for that income category is 954 units. And that's 954 of the 5,800 need to be low income. So again, the total allocation is not just units of any income category. It needs to be in specific income categories. And the graphic on this slide, I think, depicts it in a very easy to read way, where you can see that the housing units to be planned for about 40% above moderate, or what most people would refer to as market rate housing, with the remaining 60% at affordable levels ranging from very low to moderate. We do have some initial analysis on the housing needs and existing conditions in the city that we wanted to share with you before we kick off our poll on the next slide. So looking at the housing stock in the city in 2010, that would be the blue bar on the chart. And then in 2020, which would be the green bar, there are approximately 34,000 units in the city. Almost 40% of them are single family, with the remaining 60+% multifamily. Over the 10 years, you can see that the growth in housing unit types has really been in the multifamily 5+ units, which is the last bar grouping to the right. Whereas the other categories of housing have stayed relatively similar. And with that, we wanted to kick off our first poll question on related to housing stock and location. So we'd like to ask, what type of housing does Walnut Creek need the most? And please pick one of these answers: single family, condominiums or townhomes, apartments, or accessory dwelling units. So we'd like to ask you all to vote, and I'll give you about maybe 30 seconds to get your votes in. I'm not seeing any votes coming in. I'm wondering if there's a technical, oh, here we go. Okay, it took a minute. Okay, maybe I'll give it about 30 seconds more. It looks like we only have one vote so far. So I would encourage everybody who's attending to cast a vote here. Okay, it looks like we have some more votes coming in. Also, I wanted to mention, anyone attending the meeting via phone can call in and take the survey online and share their comments and questions with Andy specifically. And we're providing his email address at the end of this presentation. And Andy has indicated that he will call the people who have phoned in tomorrow to get that input. Great, it looks like we are getting quite a few votes, and it looks like all of the polling questions came to you at once, which was not the intention, but it looks like that's what's happening. So I'm going to give a couple of minutes here so that people can have time to vote, I guess, on the other questions. I don't want to cut anyone off. It looks like we're getting good participation. I'm seeing 70% of attendees have voted. Okay, well, I think we'll end the poll for now. There'll be other opportunities because it looks like a lot of people voted on all of the questions that we're going to review. So there will be more opportunities for voting. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so for those who haven't voted on the second question, what type of housing does Walnut Creek need the most? Oh, I'm sorry, sorry. What area of the city should new housing go in? The downtown area near transit and shopping districts, in suburban areas, primarily outside the downtown core, or other. And we'd like you to please, if you have an other answer, if you could click on the Q&A and answer the question, maybe indicating the question that you're answering in the Q&A. Okay, so moving on to the next slide, we have more information to share with you from our preliminary analysis on looking at renters versus owners. So in Walnut Creek, about 65% of households own their home, 35% rent, which is pretty consistent with Contra Costa County. Walnut Creek is the bar to the left, Contra Costa is in the middle, and the Bay Area is to the right. And you can see that both the county and Walnut Creek have a significantly higher rate of home ownership compared to the Bay Area as a whole. Looking at rents also, and rent growth in the last 10 years, data indicates that rents in Walnut Creek have increased 58% over the last 10 years, which is higher than Contra Costa County at 45%, and also slightly higher than the Bay Area as a whole. In terms of home value or home prices, according to Zillow, home values in Walnut Creek have doubled in the last 10 years, which is generally consistent, but slightly higher than Contra Costa County and the Bay Area as a whole. Okay, I think a lot of people have answered questions, but just in case there's anyone out there who didn't answer the third question, what types of affordable housing are most needed? Special needs housing for seniors, persons with disabilities, and/or veterans, more affordable housing units across the board, incentives for accessory dwelling units, or other. And again, on the other answer, we'd like you to type in the Q&A, indicate the question that you're answering, and please do put your answer. I'll pause just another moment for that in case there are any additional answers being input. And then I will move on to the next data point to share with you. Talking about rents and home prices, it's also important to look at income and see how that's changed in the last 10 years. So census data from the American Community Survey indicates that median income in Walnut Creek was $80,734 in 2010, and in 2019, $120,238. So that's a 49% increase in 10 years. However, that is less of an increase than rents at 58% and home value of over 100%. So we can see that incomes and wages have not been keeping pace with housing costs. Then we have looked at something called cost burden households. So cost burden really means a household that spends over 30% of their income on housing costs. Severely cost burden would be a household that spends over 50% of their income on their housing costs. Looking at the data, owners in Walnut Creek, 31%, almost a third, spend over 30% of their income on housing. Of that third, 14% spend over 50% and are severely cost burdened. In terms of renters, 43% of renters, very high percentage, spend over 30% of their income on rent. Of that 43%, about a quarter spend over 50% of their income on housing costs. So higher percentages of renter households being cost burdened and severely cost burdened in the city. I think these are the last polling questions for housing. What do you feel is the biggest issue or challenge for housing in Walnut Creek? Is it affordability, lack of housing choices, commute times, access to shopping services, or quality or design of existing housing? I'll allow a moment for any last answers. Okay, and at this point, I thought it'd be a good idea to stop, pause, and take a look at the polling. Hopefully everyone can see my screen with the poll results. So it looks like in terms of the housing that Walnut Creek needs the most, apartments are the most popular answer at 40%. And then condominiums after that at 33%. So we've got 73% of respondents saying that multifamily is the most needed. What area of the city should the housing go in? New housing. And a pretty overwhelming majority are saying the downtown area, near transit and shopping. What types of affordable housing are most needed? And it looks like 80% affordable housing across the board for everyone. We also had 13% with special needs and 7% to incentivize accessory dwelling units. So affordable housing appears to be a very big issue. As we can see in number 4, 87% of you responded that affordability is the biggest housing issue and challenge in the city today, which is a very large percentage. And here, I think we are going to pause and share some information with you on the safety element before we get into the results. So the safety element is the second element of the book of the general plan, as I put it. It's the second chapter that we are updating at this time. Again, just like the housing element, it is a required element as part of the city's general plan. And the purpose is really to identify and reduce the risk and hazard of disasters, both natural and human-caused disasters. These are things like fire and flood, droughts, and earthquakes. The safety element does contain goals and policies that focus on reducing risks, preventing disasters, and making sure the community is prepared, with the objective of preventing and reducing incidents of death, injury, property damage, and dislocation. The safety element does cover emergency care and response and what that looks like in the city. It addresses hazardous materials and waste planning. And in some instances, it addresses crime reduction in the community. So the safety element, like the housing element, really does address environmental justice issues in the community as well. The safety element will also contain maps of seismic and geological hazards, as well as evacuation routes, water supply requirements, minimum road widths, and clearances around structures. The reason for this update is very similar to a lot of the reasons that I've provided earlier in the presentation. State law does require that when you update the housing element, that you incorporate new information and update the safety element as well. So there's a state law also that requires a city to address climate change through what's called a vulnerability assessment and to develop adaptation and resiliency strategies for the climate change issues. The city has completed this in 2020. It identifies the community's exposure to things like air quality, extreme heat, flooding, and wildfire. The safety element will incorporate the vulnerability assessment that was previously done. There are also several relevant plans that will be incorporated in the safety element. The city is a participant in the Contra Costa County multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan. So on a regional basis, the hazard mitigation plan evaluates risk from natural and human-caused hazards and recommends hazard mitigation strategies or ways to alleviate those hazards. State law allows cities to summarize and incorporate the adopted local hazard mitigation plans in the safety element, which is what will be occurring for Walnut Creek safety element. The city also adopted an emergency management plan in 2020. This provides information that's also relevant to the safety element update on disasters, disaster response, and recovery operations. So here we are at the poll for the safety element questions. And I think that I think the poll is closed, but I will just sort of review the results of the polls. So starting with this question, what is the most pressing safety concern in the city? 40% said climate change, 20% said drought, severe weather. We had 27% with other, which I will go to the Q&A to take a look at. Okay, I don't see answers in the Q&A, so I will continue. And then we had 7% with wildfires and earthquakes each. Moving on to the next question. How concerned are you about climate change? And we have a tie between concerned and extremely concerned, each at 27%, very concerned at 20%. So those that are concerned total about 80%, close to 80% of the respondents. Have you been impacted by wildfire? 87% experienced poor air quality, 13% other. No one had experienced an evacuation or property or home damage. Do you feel that the community is prepared for an emergency? The answers were pretty split. 53% said no, and 47% said yes. Which of the following hazards concerns you the most? Wildfire was the largest at 47%, drought at 20%, earthquake at 13%, extreme heat at 7%. How prepared is your household for an emergency? 60% said somewhat prepared and 13% said prepared. 13% also said very prepared. So we've got over 80% saying that they feel at least somewhat prepared or higher. 13% responded that they did not feel prepared. I've shared the results. I hope that that worked. I attempted to do that for the housing element questions, but I'm not sure that it worked. But hopefully everyone can take a look at the poll results. Okay. So moving on to our last phase of the presentation, which is community engagement. So we've prepared a community engagement plan working with the city that documents and guides the community engagement efforts through this over a year-long process. And so it really does provide a comprehensive process to engage all segments of the community, stakeholders, community organizations, residents, and others. It outlines outreach methods, it identifies engagement leaders, and identifies meeting types and dates that are known at this time. And the plan is available on the Housing Element website, which we will provide a link to at the end of this presentation. So we encourage you to take a look at that plan. Just some highlights from the community engagement plan. Outreach methods are the housing and safety element web pages that are established for public review. We have surveys beyond what we just did with the polling. There are surveys online, and we will provide the links to that and on the last slide, close to the last slide. And we really do encourage you all to complete the surveys and encourage all of your family, friends, neighbors, coworkers, everyone you know. Getting a lot of input on this process is really important to a good planning process. The city will be conducting email blasts and social media posts on all of its social media websites. There'll be public workshops. This was the first of 2 that are planned. There'll be a library kiosk set up for information, handouts at the farmers market, announcement at Planning Commission and City Council meetings, and regional resources to support local engagement on a more regional level as well. The engagement leaders really are, the community leaders, resident leaders, City Council and Planning Commission, stakeholder focus groups, which will be identified as we go through the process, city staff, and then consultants to support the process. The meeting dates and times that are identified in the community engagement plan include the Planning Commission and the City Council study sessions that were completed last month. We have 2 public workshops, the first of which was tonight. The second will be April 20th. 2 safety committee meetings, and that is a committee established for the safety element update. Those are more professionals who work in safety, the safety industry, police and fire. And when that committee is seated, those meetings will be scheduled. We also will have 2 Planning Commission and 2 City Council meetings throughout the process to receive the draft and the final versions of the housing element. So the surveys that I just mentioned on the previous slide, again, we really, really encourage your participation. We would love to get lots of responses, to get lots of input for the process. They are online on the housing element and safety element web pages, and these are the links. This workshop will be shared, the presentation and the video. So there'll be plenty of opportunities for you to find the links. You can also contact the city. We're asking that the surveys be completed by April 10th, which allows about 3 weeks so that we can sort of continue the process of updating the elements. And as I mentioned, the housing element webpage, dedicated webpage, and the safety element web pages are here, links provided. We also welcome input, suggestions, concerns, and any ideas that you can email directly to Andy with his email address shown. If you have ideas about potential sites for new housing, if you are a property owner who's interested in redeveloping your property into housing, that would be very helpful to know during this process. And please do include your contact information so that we can reach out and maybe ask follow-up questions and keep the conversation going. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your participation. And here is Andy's contact information if you have any additional questions and comments. I think we're going to close this part of the workshop, the presentation section, and we're going to focus more on the Q&A at this point. So we welcome all of you to please type your questions in the Q&A. I'm going to take a look right now to see what we have. Yeah, I think that the polling happened all at once. for some reason. And so I really appreciate everybody's participation in answering those poll questions before we covered them with the slides. How long will the survey be open? Until April 10th. And the survey was just posted last week. So I don't believe that there's been a lot of participation to date, but I would defer to city staff if that is what I've said is incorrect. It looks like infill housing was a suggestion in terms of, I think that was location. Affordability being a very large issue. The poll results during tonight's meeting really indicate that affordability is a very big concern and issue in the community. And these are, okay, see, answered questions.
And Hida, as you mentioned, we actually did get one more question popped in, but just to remind folks that if you're drawing a blank at the moment and you bolt up in the middle of the night, wait, I had a question, feel free to contact me directly. And my contact information was posted. It's on our website, walnut-creek.org/HEU, Housing Element Update. And I can respond to you directly as well.
Okay, it looks like we have, so I can answer Mark M's question, how do we ensure that the housing goals are actually met during the next cycle? So what I would say to that is that how the laws related to housing elements have become, there are more laws, I'll put it that way. And so there is a requirement that there be a feasibility analysis done on the sites identified. So there has to be evidence provided, substantial evidence that a site will eventually be developed with housing. So that is a new change since the last housing element. Also, there's a requirement that every constraint that's identified, every housing constraint, or any issue that limits housing in any way, have a corresponding program or action by the city to alleviate or mitigate that constraint. So this cycle is going to be very different than the last cycle. Let's see. Someone was at the farmer's market yesterday and there was no information, flyers available for the city council member to share. I will defer to city staff on the timing of the information.
Yeah, that we actually had planned on getting that out for this last weekend, but unfortunately, and the reason why I'm actually at home is I got caught by the COVID bug, and so things took a pause. So that I will take the blame on that one, and we're going to try to get that out for the next farmers market.
The next question is, what will the next can you describe how the public comments become part of the housing element? That's a very good question. Actually, I think the most direct way for I think the community to see how they get incorporated is that the housing element will have an appendix with the entire community engagement process, including the plan, including the survey results, including the workshop presentation. It will literally have a printout of the questions that were asked and the answers from tonight and for the workshop on April 20th. But overall, what I can tell you is that there's a housing needs section of the housing element. And so that input is going to be incorporated into that section from tonight's meeting. As we move forward with the community engagement process, we will be looking to any property owner interests that will be cited in the housing element in terms of specific sites. We'll be talking with the development community to ask them, what have they considered Walnut Creek? Why or why not? That will all be documented in the housing element as well. So I wanted to clarify how this engagement would then make its way, translate into the housing element. The next workshop will have the survey results, And we'll be talking more about the sites that would be identified as where the housing units will be going to collect some input on that in terms of locations. The fair housing piece indicates low income needs to be distributed across the city, yet over 80% of the polling indicates they want most of the housing downtown. How will this be handled? That's a very good question. There is a requirement as part of the affirmatively furthering fair housing section that you can't concentrate affordable housing in just one location, which is very true. So, you know, cities and counties need to do their best to try to distribute it throughout the community. That said, we also need to be able to show with substantial evidence that sites will be developed or redeveloped with housing. So it is a delicate balance between where there's substantial evidence that can be shown versus where the housing will be distributed. Because property owners and property owner developer interest is a factor. So once we are able to engage the development community more and property owners more, we'll have a more definitive answer about that. I think what we're asking in the poll is some initial information from the community about needs and potential solutions. And I think the last question has to do with the city's ADU ordinance.
Yes, I can provide a quick update on that. The ADU ordinance was actually adopted last September and went into effect in October. So that's on the books already. And then the pre-approved ADU plans is something that's still moving ahead. Other staff in the planning department's working on it at the moment. The final pre-approved plans have not yet been adopted. And I would actually have to check and get back to you to see what the current timeline is on that. I'm not directly involved in that particular effort.
Great. I have an update too. Apparently we have 80 survey responses so far since last week. Someone had asked the question, how many responses to the survey? And that's amazing that there are 80 just in several days. So I think that is a wonderful indication that the community is very engaged. Let's see the next question. One of the barriers to building low-income affordable housing is NIMBYism. How can the city mitigate that this type of housing gets the momentum it needs? That's a very good question. I think that the laws that have been passed that are related to housing and the housing element really go to address, because to be honest, the laws that have been passed do remove some local control and really do sort of encourage cities to be proactive about finding solutions that can be backed up with evidence. It is very different than the last housing element cycle. It's not just about the planning of housing this cycle, it's about proving that it can actually happen from a development economics perspective. And property owner interest is also an important factor. So I think that is what makes this cycle very different, and how affordable housing might be dealt with in this cycle very different than in the previous housing element cycles. And how many are on Zoom tonight? I see 25 participants, but there's 6. So it looks like 19. I'm going to guess that 19 people who are tuning in. And then, okay, great. And I don't see, I just see very nice comments thanking us for the information. Thank you, Andy. Okay. So I would say if there are any more questions, now would be a great time to include them. But if you think of something after the oh, here we go. What is the city doing to ensure we are creating housing for truly extremely low income housing? not just what's determined by RENA, which I doing math correctly, is housing up to, yes, you're doing your math correctly. Like for folks making $15 an hour. Yeah, so extremely low and low is combined into one category. I know on the table that we showed you. The housing element, what's required to put in the housing element for the state is that they look for a section on extremely low income households. You have to identify what the needs are in the needs section, and then you have to have a program to implement either zoning changes or funding mechanisms or other types of solutions to facilitate the development of that housing. And again, there are some state laws that have been passed that allow housing at that income level to not have to face the same type of approvals and sort of roadblocks as in previous years. I hope that answers the question. If not, please feel free to type in a follow-up. Okay, well, I would say that if you think of any questions, anything comes to you after the workshop, please do email Andy at the email address that we provided. We really encourage you to encourage all of your family, friends, neighbors, coworkers, everybody to please fill out the survey. That's really important information, very helpful information for planning housing in your community.
And thank you all for joining us and for participating. Your voice is very important. Your participation is very important, and really want to thank you for taking the time out of your evening to join us and to help us in this important effort. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your participation.